exploring all the possibilities. Several of my French friends have gone into it very extensively, but the difficulties of making explorations across the Sahara are extreme. For example, Count Byron de Prorok, a Polish nobleman with an American wife, made several journeys across the Sahara in the 1920s and managed in the process to discover the grave of one of the last descendants of what he considered to be the Atlantean royal family, Queen Antenea. And I actually saw her skeleton myself about 50 years ago. Unfortunately, the skeleton was subsequently taken to a museum in North Africa and has since disappeared and has not been seen by anybody for about 25 years. Now deal with the most famous hypothesis of all. That is the assumption that the island of Santorin in the eastern Mediterranean was Atlantis. This has been put forward by Professor Gavronopoulos, a very well-known authority on seismology, who is a Greek professor, and a number of his friends. To my mind, it is untenable. I may say that it was first ventilated in the year, I think, 1912, when a man called Frost wrote to the London Times suggesting that Crete might have been the Atlantis on the basis of which Plato wrote.
And seductive the Santorini thesis is, too. Here's John V. Luce, a classics professor and author of The End of Atlantis, in his rooms at Trinity College, Dublin.
I've been an Irishman born and bred, and there have always been traditions in the west of Ireland, particularly of land to the west of the lost continent, and I was always interested in the legend of Atlantis as a result, but I'd never gone into it in a scholarly way, you might say, till, I suppose, the early 1960s, when I began to be a lecturer on Hellenic cruises, and often we have to lecture on topics which we're not experts in. It fell to my lot to do Minoan and Crete on one cruise, so I read all the standard works on Minoan and Crete, and in the course of this reading I came on a reference to the possibility that the lost civilization of Atlantis was really the lost civilization of Minoan and Crete, and something sort of clicked in my mind at that stage, and I thought, that's a very interesting hypothesis, I'll work a bit more at that. So I worked it up in the form of a lecture, and almost simultaneously there were some exciting archaeological discoveries on the island of Santorini, or Thera, in the Aegean, which seemed to mesh in very well with the line I was working on. So on this island you have a buried city, rather like Pompeii or Herculaneum, which was filled in with ash from the Santorini volcano, and which has preserved the houses to an extraordinary degree. They're still standing up to 4 stories in some places. All the beautiful fresco decorations are still on the walls, the storerooms crowded with beautiful vases, and you get the impression that life just finished the other day in these places. Extraordinary close immediate sense of contact with the past.
What time would that have been?
Well, the date is disputed, but not within wide limits, because our knowledge of the pottery for that period is extensive, and there are many synchronisms with Egypt which gives us an absolute dating. But the experts are sort of arguing as between, say, 1500 BC and 1450 BC. It's within the limits of about 50 years.
How does that jibe with other theories of when Atlantis must have existed?
Well, of course, it does agree with the primary dating in this case, which comes from Plato's treatment of the legend, and he is quite explicit that the events which he describes occurred 9,000 years before his own day. Well, that would put them back to about 10,000 BC, that sort of date.
Plato's Atlantis was 10,000.
Plato's Atlantis, yes, 10 to 9,000 BC. So it doesn't agree well with that, and one has to argue as to whether the figure has been perhaps garbled in the course of transmission or something of the sort. But I have my own explanation for the 9,000 figure. It relates to Plato's view of Egyptian chronology, which he was not well informed about. He, like a modern tourist, went to ancient Egypt and was astonished by their civilization, and the priests who talked to him managed to impress him with their great antiquity and trotted out evidence which he was inclined to accept, that Egypt went back for 10,000 years, which of course totally incorrect. We know that now. And I think they put him off about the dating, but his date of 9,000 years before his time is just meant to indicate something in the remote past.
There are some even who suggest Plato was careless enough to have added a zero to his reckoning, that he meant to record Atlantis' destruction in 900 and not 9,000 BC. But Egerton Sykes won't have any of it.
I find myself somewhat embarrassed by the peculiar nature of the accusations which are made against Plato in connection with his works on Atlantis. Plato was perhaps the most important philosophical writer of the great Greek era of philosophy. He was a man of unquestioned integrity and a man who, while being slightly involved in politics, as all Greeks of his status had to be, he was certainly not, to my mind, the type of person who would have mutilated or destroyed the validity of his philosophical theories simply to please the Greek government of the day. If one looks back at the records of the various philosophers who suffered death and imprisonment rather than change their opinions in that period, I fail to see the slightest reason why it should have been assumed that Plato would have been any less capable of standing up for himself than the others. And that was the standard on which Greek philosophy of the period was based. Next thing is this. Plato was one of the wisest men of his time, and there was no reason at all to suppose that he would make the stupid mistake of misinterpreting the Egyptian calendar, particularly when it is borne in mind that he himself visited Egypt and spent a period of several months there. Well, during that time he had as good an opportunity as anybody else at becoming acquainted with the vagaries of the Egyptian calendrical system, and he would certainly not have made mistaken references to it in his writings when he came back afterwards. These judgments on a man who is now dead and was one of the greatest men of his period are, in the main, passed by people who are confident of the fact that the person they attack cannot possibly hit back, and also that there are very few people who are inclined to go and stand up and defend him, as I'm trying to do now.
Plato's myths are an appeal to the imagination as much as to the reason, and they have a sort of artistic quality of vivid presentation. They're like a play, really, which symbolizes things which convey more that can be put in logical terms. All this is very important and should be brought out in an all-round discussion.
All right. Isn't there some pretty convincing evidence for the cataclysmic destruction of the civilization in Crete?
Yes, but unfortunately, there is not one single facet of the civilization of Crete